Hi, good afternoon. This is the Sustainability channel for the Link for Growth group, and we have Tim again today to discuss what we're going to do about this winter and how we're going to cope with, or how we can cope a little bit more sustainably with our lives during the colder months. We've got chestnuts just about ripening, not quite in my area, but just starting to ripen near Tim. We've got apples and pears, good British fruits, great for preserving for the winter. And hopefully, if you've been lucky enough to have a garden, you'll have grown your potatoes and onions and root vegetables, which will be clamping up ready for the winter. So there's your food. What are we going to do about the energy? Tim, how are you?
Hi, I'm pretty good today, and fortunately just at the moment Cardiff is really sunny because we're stuck in this high pressure air, so I'm sort of contemplating the autumn and things starting to get colder as the nights draw in, but we're not quite there yet. But I was talking to a friend of mine earlier on today who was asking some serious questions about, well, what do I do to save energy during the winter? I suppose of interest. I mean, he hadn't picked up as what I would say with it is it's about keeping you warm, not necessarily keeping your property warm. So, I mean, as a straightforward thing for everybody, if you want to make, and it actually apparently makes quite a big difference nationally in terms of our carbon footprint, is just get hold of the thermostat and just turn it down a couple of degrees. You don't need to have sort of tropical type temperatures in your house in mid-December. I mean, I know it's easier to do and we tend not to think about it, but the odds are our energy bills are going to be going up this winter just because the pound has fallen in value. I think, as we've said before, Britain now imports more energy than it exports. So we are going to be paying more for our energy as the winter progresses. So it's in everybody's interest, actually, just to turn that thermostat down a notch. So that's the simplest thing you can do.
It's interesting, that one, because I don't like it too warm indoors, particularly not at night. I prefer to have a cold bedroom. My other half, on the other hand, he likes it very warm. We have this ongoing little, turn the thermostat up and down battle. I come in and I find it too hot and turn it down, and he finds it too cold and turns it back up again. I think it's largely to do with how much you're active yourself anyway. If you're up and about doing things, you stay warmer. If you're sitting on your computer or whatever, or maybe doing your paperwork, then you do tend to get cooler. Offices tend to have quite high temperatures in their offices, mainly because they're sitting a lot doing whatever it is they're doing, and they're not up and about and active, whereas I don't tend to sit too often.
One of the things you could do, it depends how your house is set up. One of the things I do, my office here is upstairs, and in the winter you'll actually notice a good 2 or 3 degree difference just walking down the stairs. So again, if you've got somebody that's nagging you because they're feeling cold downstairs, send them upstairs.
Just above the kitchen, yeah.
Oh, right, yeah, so you'll actually get a blast of warmth every time you nip out and make a cup of tea. I mean, the other point with that, of course, is actually rather than turning the heating up a notch, sticking a sweater on works. The point with this, I guess, as well as carbon footprint stuff, is actually when you come to look at your energy bills at the end of the quarter, actually even simple steps like these actually start to knock a good few quid off the bill. So it's worth doing just on cost-saving grounds. So essentially it's just that question of putting your sweater on and leaving it on rather than expecting to sit around in a t-shirt.
The advantage of living in a terrace cottage, I think, you have warmth from either side.
Well, I mean, yes, there's a friend of mine who has a stone cottage, and that is remarkable for staying cool in summer and warm in winter. And that's because from the period that it was built, it's back in the days before central heating. And, so basically that was how people did it in those days, to try to manage heat.
One of those things I've really been surprised that we haven't utilised far more. You see it more in Australia, uses it quite a bit, the actual pitch of the roof, so you collect this, or the summer sun is bounced off the house, and quite often they'll have solar panels on the roof to collect that energy. But the pitch of the roof is such that when the winter sun comes around, it gets full sun comes through all the windows. And so you're utilising every bit of the sun's warmth that's available. Obviously, that's not necessarily going to keep you terribly, terribly warm, but it will certainly help.
Well, I mean, one of the things, if you can afford the outlay, the solar thermal panels rather than the solar photovoltaic. Because one of your problems with solar voltaic, if you're using it for heating, is you're converting sunlight into electricity, then using the electricity to heat water. One of the things a solar thermal panel will allow you to do is heat the water directly. And again, that can have huge savings off your energy bill at the end of a winter. As if you think, sort of midwinter, if you park the car somewhere where it's in sunlight, and then you come back after a couple of hours, it's actually quite warm inside the car just from sunlight.
Yes.
So essentially a solar thermal panel is doing the same thing during the winter, so it's absorbing that heat. So that again, it's storing in the same way as you store hot water in your storage tanks, and it's insulated, and but it means that you're having to spend that much less on using your domestic fuel to heat water.
And that's quite an important part of what we use, isn't it? We use hot water for all kinds of things, not just for personal washing and our clothing and our washing up and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, it can be a substantial part of what you spend. I mean, if you use it for central heating during the winter, again, that's a huge cost. But I try very hard not to put central heating on at all. Now, I think I had the central heating on for about a week in total for the whole of last winter.
Wow.
But, I mean, admittedly, last winter was particularly mild. Even I'm not sort of going to be so sort of determined that I'm going to sit here with snow on the ground freezing to death just to make the point. But there are things you can do. One of the things I do a lot here is make use of heavy curtains. You have to sort of do a bit of opening and closing as the sun goes around the house. But essentially, if you leave the windows where the sun is coming in, you leave the curtains open, but keep all of the other windows with curtains closed. So basically, you're allowing the sun's heat in through the windows that are exposed, and then you're trapping the heat in with the curtain in. Basically, with me, I'll have a bit in the morning on the back, then I have to close those curtains, then a couple of hours later I open them up at the front. But again, that's adding a couple of degrees to the temperature inside your house passively. You're not paying for that. I mean, you have the initial outlay for a set of curtains, which if you're struggling for any reason, go down to the local charity shop, have a look on Free Cycle. There is always somebody that's got a set of heavy curtains that they want to get rid of. So again, it's a passive way of sort of keeping and using best the heat you've already got.
Yes, yeah.
And the other one that I'd have mentioned to my mate, because they're really out of fashion, I guess, but it's a really good thing to do, is get a hot water bottle. Rather than having to heat your bedroom in the night, if you pop a hot water bottle in the bed and you're going to sort of basically strip off and jump straight into bed, then just having that hot water bottle under the duvet just to take the edge off it is all you need, because your body temperature is going to warm you up pretty quickly once you're under the duvet.
My other half's my hot water bottle. He's a.
So you one of these that put your feet on his back.
Most of the time. I do okay on that one. I'm the one with the freezing cold feet.
But yeah, I mean, again, it's because if you go back to the idea that what you're in the business of doing is keeping yourself warm, not keeping your house warm. So I mean, here I've done the double glazing and the wall insulation and the roof insulation, all of that. The difficulty with that is, I mean, it's a great thing to do, but it only stops about a quarter of the heat that leaches out of a house. So there's still an awful lot of the heat that you're putting in that's going to go straight out through the side of the house or through the roof. And with energy prices as they are, effectively, who wants to be paying just to heat the neighborhood?
No, not.
So, I mean, I tend to go for heating a room rather than heating the house, which you can do either by knocking all of the radiators off except for the one in the room that you're in. I tend to go, I've got one of these little fan heaters, an electric one. I tend just to do a blast of that. Yeah, and again, it hasn't got to be on all the time. It's just give it a blast to take the edge off it, then knock it off. For me, as I say, I work upstairs. The room I'm in is fairly contained. So once I've got it warm, it tends to stay warm. So yes, it's doable. There's beyond that, if you have real problems and you really wanted not to spend any money on energy at all, go down to your local camping shop and you'll find all sorts of warm gear for sort of going out into the Arctic or the high mountains. Get your thermal socks and your thermal underwear and all the rest of that on, and you'll find that you cook even in freezing temperatures.
You could always put your feet in one of those sleeping bags while you were sitting at the desk.
Yeah, one of the things I used to have, I had it stolen, way back in the 1980s, and I've never been able to find one since, it was an army or Norwegian army surplus sniper's sleeping bag. It was essentially a sleeping bag that came with a hood and sleeves.
All right.
Basically, you could sit in that and do your typing at the computer and whatever you wanted to do and be boiling. It was designed, apparently, you could sit out in temperatures down to about -20 without any problem. And I never actually tried it that cold. But certainly, when I was younger, instead of having a tent, I would actually just sleep in that out in the open air, and it was fine. So something like that you can do. In terms of staying warm, usefully, it's a sleeping bag, so you could even sleep in it if need be. Probably not the most comfortable if you're doing it all the time, because it's going to get sweaty and mingy. But they are as I say, depending on what your relationship to energy is going to be. That's more the extreme end, but you can still do it. Certainly anyone that was struggling on benefits, or if you are able to get a good sleeping bag, then actually that can be a good way of staying warm, even if you can't afford the heating. So, and all of these things involve striking balances.
Yes, I found a coffee shop for working is pretty good.
Well, one of the origins of pubs in Britain was as somewhere that we could go collectively that was warm in the evening. I think probably, certainly when I was younger, as a child, it was unusual to have houses with central heating. I vaguely remember the first house that I've lived in since I was born. I remember the central heating being put into that, which would have been, I think I was about 10 years old. So back in those days, if you wanted to be warm during the day, you tended to have open fires in the house. So you had a chimney and you could throw some coal on and you could sort of vaguely warm a house. Although I think most of the warmth used to just go up the chimney. But yeah, one of the ways people stayed warm was to go to the pub. I'm not sure whether you can do it now just because of the expense. But one of the things that would be useful, I know you've got cafes up your neck of the woods that do it, where you have people do talks and stuff in the evening at the local cafe. So again, that's becoming quite a useful way. Yeah, and it has the social benefits, of course.
Well, that's the main thing, isn't it? It's. I think a lot of the time, if you're mentally stimulated, you don't notice the environment as much. You still get cold, of course, but busy doing things with other people and thinking and or listening to some show or other. Then there's two benefits in there, as you say, the social aspect of meeting and greeting other people and communicating with people in your sphere, particularly if it's an interest group. And also, because you're just busy doing things, so you don't notice the environment quite so much. It's not quite a big an impact.
And all of us are radiating heat as well. So basically, if you put 20 of us in a room to listen to a talk and we all have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, there's a lot of heat being radiated into that room without doing anything. As long as that room is reasonably kind of insulated, then you're going to stay warm.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, as you say, if you're going to then you need the extra sweaters and stuff. I mean, one of my problems here that I remember from the last time we had snow here, which is what, 2, 3 years ago, must be 3 years ago, was I'm in an area where it's very difficult to get out. Once the snow has fallen, is you get this thing where it packs down to kind of almost like an ice rink. Because there are so many people who walk on the pavements. As a result, when you get as arthritic and as old as I am, you get very nervous about walking on that. I am several miles away from the nearest shops. So one of the things I've always got to keep an eye out for here with weather forecasting is if something like snow is on the way, I've got to make sure I provision in advance. And again, staying warm then, because you effectively, if you have a week's worth of snow, you're going to batten down the hatches for a week. That's it. You're not going to be going anywhere. So again, I mean, it's looking at how do I insulate my house? How do I insulate myself? Within the bounds of, okay, there's no point in freezing to death if you've got to. So yes, if worst comes to worst, I'll bang the gas heating on and it can stay on for a couple of hours. But I do begrudge spending the money at the end of the quarter when I've got to pay the bill.
But yes, but it's a good time to make sure your boilers and things are all working and have them maintained.
Yeah. Well, we're at that time now probably where you want to go around and check all of the radiators are bled properly. And because you don't want to wait until the autumn sets in, then discover they're not working, because that's precisely the time when you're not going to get a plumber because they're busy, because everybody's doing the same thing.
Yes.
So you've probably still got time now while it's still a bit warm during the day to do it. Yes, my other thing.
Yes, our heating's been on a couple of times already because my other half really doesn't like it if it gets cold. He really does seem to struggle. But and he's at home more than I am. I tend to be out a lot, so because I'm still working and I'm out in. And also because I clean, I suppose. I go into other people's properties, and so it's they vary considerably about how warm they're kept. Myself and my colleague get quite because we're running around doing the cleaning. We go into the houses which are kept, let's say, warm, suitably warm for their occupants, but we don't like it. It's too warm for us.
I think my concession to the cold so far is just that I've dug out my woolly slippers and put them on a couple of times. That's one of my problems. I have a circulation problem in the end of my toes, so if they get cold, that causes problems. So my slippers tend to be the first sign of winter in my house. That, I'm wearing slippers, it must be autumn. So basically, I'll probably end up, I usually wear my way through a pair of slippers in the course of a winter. So fortunately, they're not too expensive. So, but basically, once it starts to get cold, I'll have slippers on all the time around the house. And that'll stay through till March, April next year. But again, it's cheaper than putting heating on because your feet are cold. And at the moment, the rest of me isn't. And it hasn't got that cold yet. I think we did have a day last week where it got down to about 3 degrees first thing in the morning. That's about as cold as it's been so far.
Yes, we've had a couple of days which were a bit chilly, but most of the time still relatively warm at the moment. Yeah, and especially after the sun's been up an hour or two, come sort of 9, 10 o'clock, it's quite pleasant, really.
From what I've seen of long-term weather forecasting, I mean, serious, not the stuff you get in the Daily Express that tells you we're going to have an ice age, because they do that one every year. The serious long-term weather forecasting that's based on jet stream movements and stuff, I think they were suggesting that we're most likely to get a winter like last year.
That suits me.
Well, depending on where you are, because, of course, last year had a lot of flooding as well.
Well, that's true.
But their suggestion was that we're far more likely to get these storm fronts coming in off the Atlantic than we are to get the kind of Arctic or eastern air that brings snow. So as you say, yes, benefits are that it's unlikely to get that cold. The downside of it is if you're in a flood risk area, you could well find yourself underwater. Of course, there are steps that people can take to mitigate that. One of the things that's worth looking at for anyone that lives on a floodplain or is at risk of flooding is to actually turn your house upside down. Essentially move all of your electrical gear upstairs, move your living area upstairs if need be, and actually minimize what's downstairs, or have activities and things that don't involve electricity downstairs. It's basically one of the things that causes a lot of the expense is you lose, things like refrigerators, washing machines. Once flood water has been through them, they're of no use to you thereafter. Because they'll just hold the pollution that comes through with the flood water. If you have to have electrical points in the downstairs of a house that's at risk, actually, if you can afford it, get an electrician in and actually put the plug sockets up on the ceiling level rather than down on the skirting board. That was one of my things that I did as a very young man after leaving university, was I did a report into the flooding in North Wales in 1990. So I'd sort of picked up all of these things about what you could do with flooding then, and the advice hasn't changed. So there were people on the news last year with the flooding saying all of the same things. There is a flood watch scheme in the UK that you can sign up to that gives you an automated message if there's a flood risk to your house. I guess people that live in flood risk areas kind of know this, but just in case anyone didn't, it's worth Google that and sign up for it. Because actually just getting that extra hour's notice that there's a chance of flooding is enough for you to get your valuables upstairs. I'm okay if the floodwaters get so high that even moving stuff upstairs is going to be a problem, then actually your valuables at that point aren't going to be a worry. Getting out alive at that point becomes the worry. As I say, I don't, insofar as you can accurately give a weather trend for a winter, from what I've seen, that's the best trending that anyone's been able to put together, is we're likely to see more of that. And we're unlikely to see really cold weather.
I think part of it is the properties that are being built, isn't it? Because even if you go into sort of the remotest parts of Thailand and Burma and what have you, where their homes are only made of bamboo at the end of the day, they're built up on stilts. They build them up tall for that very reason, because they have a rainy season every year. They have to. If they want to be out of the water, they have to be up. And yet somehow we haven't really taken that on board. Even when we've built houses in this country, they're still built zones in the first place. And secondly, even if they're not built up high.
There was a guy, when I did the research in North Wales, there was somebody, they were saying to me that one of the problems is they didn't realise there was a flood risk. I remember relating this to one of the officials at the Welsh government and saying, well, how come these people didn't know there were flood risk? And the Welsh government guy said, well, hang on, if you've got a sea wall at the back of your garden, how can you not realise there's a flood risk? The point is, you've got two different perspectives going on there. And the guy from the Welsh government quite rightly was saying, well, if we've got to defend your property with a flood wall, then you're at risk. Whereas what the people were thinking was, because there's a flood wall there, I'm no longer at risk. Essentially, this is the way I think modern building has done it. If you go and look at properties, at old properties along rivers, generally you'll find that they are stilted. Now, I remember travelling through Hereford along the River Wye. If you look at the houses immediately up against the River Wye in Hereford, a lot of them are actually on stilted sort of brick pillars.
There's quite a lot of steep bank away from the river, isn't there?
Yeah, so essentially they're able to cope with perhaps a 10 or 20 foot rise in the river without it starting to damage the property. Now, I think there are parts of the River Thames where you'll see the same thing. The problem comes, as you say, where a builder will have built modern houses on a floodplain and then put a river wall up somewhere that's meant to defend. And it's great as long as the defences do their job. The problem that we saw last winter in parts of the UK was there comes a point where the flood defences don't work. And actually the catastrophe then is even worse. As if you were relying on the flood defence to protect you and then it fails, actually the property itself is just not defended. So very quickly you can find that you're up to your chest in water. That is actually quite torturous for anyone that's been through it, because the electricity will short out through it.
Oh my God. Yeah,
so basically you're going to get electric shocks and stuff going on.
as well.
The other downside of that, of course, is that the time it's going to take for you to repair that property is, I mean, you're looking at 6 months to a year at best. And there's no quick way around it. And essentially, you've got to dry a property out before you can replaster, re-put the timbers in. Until you've done that, there's not much point in putting in your new sort of washing machines and fridges and stuff. So it is hugely disruptive. Now, what happened in North Wales, and I see it again, time and again since, is people get panicked into wanting to get back in, so they'll sort of go for anybody that promises to get them in quickly. And it's where you get really bod's job building done. Because you'll get somebody come in, cobble something together, it isn't done properly. I mean, you find, a couple of weeks later, all of the plaster they've just put on starts cracking and falling away again, the timber warps. So sadly, I mean, once you've been flooded, there's not a great deal you can do other than just ride it out. Anticipate that this is going to be a 12-month thing, not a 12-week thing. I think if you Google it, there's a video documentary that was made about the people on the Somerset levels in 2013 that got flooded. I think it was a BBC documentary, but I think you can find it on YouTube. And again, that's quite instructive about how difficult they found it to actually get things back together again. I think after about 18 months, most of them had got it back together again, but it was a real slog. It turned out that you had insurance companies that didn't want to pay out, you had builders that went missing, jobs that people were told were going to take a couple of weeks ended up taking months. That I think is normal for flooding. I mean, much as those people were quite upset by it, and sadly, if you get flooded, that is what you can look forward to.
Well, I presume there's only so many builders in an area, and if everybody's in the same state, then they can only do so much, can't they? And even if people from the surrounding areas come in, they've still got to stop doing the job that they were doing. They're only going to actually do that for one of two reasons. A, the place is suitable to do. It actually is dry enough, as you say. And secondly, that, those with the highest value jobs are going to get seen to first.
Well, I know the other downside, which we saw in North Wales and we've certainly seen since, is there's no protection on the word builder. And what you'll find is when there's insurance money kicking around, there are people who will come out of the woodwork claiming to be builders who have never waved a trowel around in anger in their lives. And sadly, people get taken in partly because you want to get back into your house. Sadly, that is just part of what happens when people get flooded. As the other thing that's worth thinking about if you are in that kind of area where you could be susceptible to flooding is get your paperwork upstairs. The other one that's worth doing, basically get your phone out and photograph everything. Because you will be surprised how in a flood the insurance companies will take issue with what you're claiming for. And you're going to have to prove that you had that flat screen telly or that you had the Xbox or whatever piece of kit it is you're claiming for. Particularly with jewellery. Again, we tend not to think of it, but if you've got a jewellery drawer with some valuable items there, that's the sort of thing you'll forget even to claim about. You're going to be pretty stressed out after having to deal with a flood when it comes to filling in the claim forms. So again, it's useful to have that photographic inventory just to remember that, yes, I had one of those. So not only can you list it for the insurance company, but you can show them the images of it.
And preferably the bills that you pay or the receipts that you spent on these things. But I mean, obviously that's not always possible. But
yeah, I think from what I remember with it, if you've got the photographic evidence, it's persuasive. So essentially, if you ended up having to go to the insurance ombudsman to settle a dispute, the ombudsman is likely to side with you if you've got photographs. Whereas the insurance companies might claim that, you have to produce the receipt. Well, actually, no, probably not. Great if you've got the receipt, but where it becomes difficult is where it's your word against theirs. All that's happening really is if you or I just had your usual run-of-the-mill accident around the house, you'd drop a tin of paint on the carpet or something, the odds are the insurance companies aren't going to spend a lot of money trying to minimize your claim. As basically what they're going to pay the loss adjuster to come out and do that is more than what it's going to cost just to pay you. So the tendency is with normal household claims that it's just, sign it off. Unless it obviously looks like a fraud, just pay it. Once you've got a housing estate with a couple of hundred properties that have all been hit at the same time, suddenly the insurance company is looking at a couple of £1 billion payout, and they're going to want to check that everything that's being claimed is a valid claim. And essentially, sadly, it becomes a burden of proof on you. That they're going to
say, the same old story, isn't it? Because some people will try to claim things that they never had. The Gucci watch that never existed. I've experienced that myself. I'm not in insurance. We've been in somebody's house to clean, and this woman tried to claim that we'd stolen a Gucci watch. And frankly, she was in no position to own such a thing. But she was adamant that she had one and that we'd stolen it. Not only does that make a great dent on your reputation, but it's very harsh to have to deal with when how do you prove you didn't when it didn't exist in the first place?
That happens, and as you say, sadly that then has a knock on to everyone else, because if you're making a legitimate claim, as I said, once you've got to the point where they've actually sent investigators in because they're standing to lose that kind of money, then basically they will be trying to whittle down everybody's claim. In North Wales, the classic one was what they call underinsurance, which is basically the value of the property you've insured is actually more than, or they will claim that your property was worth more than you've insured. So you might say, oh, right, I've got 10,000 quid's worth of content in the house. They'll come around and say, well, no, actually you had 20,000. Then what they'll do is say, all right, so you were only 50% insured. So we'll only pay you 50% of your claim.
Oh.
So that's how that works. Now, what happened in North Wales was they did it on people's buildings. It wasn't particularly well known at the time, but people, when they were asked what the value of their property was, people tended to put down what the sale value of the house was. So they'd say, oh, well, I bought the house for, 50,000 back in those days. So they'd write, oh, 50,000, and who would think otherwise? What it's meant to be is how much would it cost to rebuild the property if it fell over? And of course, the insurers would come out then and say, well, no, actually, it's going to cost 150,000 to rebuild your house. So you're only insured for 50,000, so we're only going to pay a third of the damages to your buildings. So actually, an awful lot of people ended up using their contents insurance just to pay to get their houses fixed. At the time I was up there, I went there interviewing people about 18 months after the flood. And I guess I talked to about 40 or 50 people who were in various states of homelessness still 18 months on. At best, you had people that had, basically their buildings had been dealt with, but they had no contents. You had people that had sort of garden chairs in the living room. That's all they had. At worst, there were people, the one couple ended up where somebody had come in and tried to rebuild the house, botched it up, and the entire house had to be demolished. So at the time I met them, which was 18 months on, they were living in a caravan on the site of what was their home. Now, in the end, partly because of the publicity that we were able to shine on them, they actually, in the end, got their house rebuilt. But that was a huge slog. They were actually a disabled couple. I think the guy was visually impaired, if not blind, and the woman had quite severe problems with diabetes. So again, they were kind of people who were the least resilient to be able to deal with that stuff. The area had, it was a sort of retirement area, but it was quite a poor retirement area. It was people from working class districts of Liverpool and Manchester. So you had a very poorly integrated community as well. People didn't know each other that well. They'd all moved from somewhere else. So where elsewhere communities might have come together to help out, that really didn't happen there. So there were a lot of elderly people there as well who, again, weren't particularly well equipped to deal with it. I mean, the bottom line answer to that is if you're in a flood risk area, get resilient before it gets flooded. Don't try to do it after, because it isn't going to work. As I say, it is something that is an ongoing thing. I mean, you are looking at a year to 2 years, touch wood, hopefully not any longer than that, but it can go that far. I mean, all of the evidence that we have now with climate change tells us that this is going to be more and more of a problem in the UK. That other parts of the world are going to get droughts and heat waves and all the rest of it. What we are going to get is an awful lot of water landing on us.
We've always been a high rainfall area in Britain anyway, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, there are basically two types of flood disaster that we have in Britain. There's the type of flood disaster that we had last year, where you have just storm after storm coming in off the Atlantic. But the difference over the last couple of years is the intensity of those storms now, and the wind speeds and the amount of water being carried are greater than we're used to. The other type that we have is basically where you get a cloud just seems to anchor up above somebody's village and just drop its contents on them. So most recently, if you think of Boscastle in Cornwall a couple of years ago, where they just had a cloud just stopped on the hills above the village and just emptied down. And within a matter of minutes, you had torrential water running down the high street, so actually washing buildings away. I mean, if you look in your history, is it 1952 or 53, the floods at Lynmouth? And it was almost exactly the same weather conditions, that a huge cloud anchored up above the top of the cliff, dropped its water and flooded the village down at the bottom.
So large quantity of water in a short period of time, and most of our systems won't cope wherever you are in the country.
Yeah. I mean, those kind of storms, basically, you're not going to survive them. I mean, basically, either your property or people are going to be lost. And basically, I mean, as things go on, it is likely to be that we get more and more water in those kind of storms. So essentially, you've got to rely there on basically the embankments and stuff that they use to divert the water back out to sea, doing the job. With the more ongoing storm stuff, I mean, I think we're going to start to see people that thus far have been immune to them starting to get hit, which we sort of saw last year in Yorkshire. So I think you had quite a bit of central Leeds got hit, and again, people didn't expect that. I think York, I mean, there are areas of York that have always flooded, but I understand it had got further than usual. So again, that's where people need to start checking their flood risk if they are on a floodplain. Just because you were sort of 10 meters above where the flood water got to last time, don't assume it's always going to be that way. And actually check out your routes when you're driving. There are several parts of Cardiff now, I mean, not really to do with sea level or anything. It's basically, we have where the railway lines run in order to connect places either side. You have roads that have been dug into a dip underneath the line. And when we get heavy rain, the space in the dip fills up. And you do get people lose their cars in them. I'm not sure how much it costs nowadays to get a garage to get rid of all the water that gets into your engine, but I think it's not going to be cheap.
Probably not even viable in most cases if you have a wet engine.
No, I mean, it can be a huge cost, presumably. So again, it's think through, well, okay, what is my route home? Okay, what is the weather forecast? Do I really need to take the route that runs along the river? Maybe cycling along the seawall isn't necessarily the best thing to do in an Atlantic storm.
No, pretty in the summer, but maybe not in the middle of a storm, no.
Well, I mean, you shouldn't have to tell people this, but then there's a piece of video earlier on this year of people stood on the harbour wall in Porthcawl in South Wales, where we get these really huge breaker waves come in, where, I mean, the authorities have warned people that you stand every chance of being washed away if you stand on there, and there are still videos of kids running up and down the wall. And it is only the grace of God that these people don't end up dead.
Look at the anti-clever.
Yeah, so, again, you shouldn't have to tell people this, but we are getting to the point where this is getting serious, that these storms aren't lightweight things. We're now starting to experience storms in Britain that are equivalent to some of the hurricanes they used to get in the Caribbean. we're talking about similar strength winds, similar content of water. Okay, I mean, the hurricanes themselves have got a lot worse, as we've seen in Haiti this week. But our storms are getting worse as well. And so, where I think a few years ago it was, almost exhilarating to stand on the seawall at Porth Call and look at those breakers, and they are really impressive. I think I've got some photographs myself somewhere that I took with my son of the waves breaking up through the rocks, and kind of, you sort of stand on the rock and you've got a wave 10, 20 foot above you. It is impressive, but we're getting to the point where that's getting dangerous. Back in those days, it wasn't that dangerous because the wave was actually splashing back away from you. We're now getting to the point that the waves are actually that high and that strong that they're washing over the top of you.
You mentioned earlier before we came on air about the ice levels and the. Yeah,
this is a guy called Peter Wadhams from Cambridge, who's, I think they reckon he's the country's leading expert on Arctic ice. He put out a warning, I think about a fortnight ago, saying that the expectation with sea level rise is a big underestimate now. He was saying a lot of what's being factored into the International Panel on Climate Change models is just the melting of the Arctic polar ice cap. Now, what he's saying is things have moved on and we're seeing an acceleration of the ice melt in Greenland and far more ice melt than anyone had thought in the Antarctic. His argument, what he's saying is, as a result of those two additional ice melts that weren't factored in, that sea level rise of about a metre or so that was anticipated for 2100, he reckons could be hitting us as early as 2030. So essentially, even between now and 2020, we're going to start to see evidence of sea level rise. Now, where we're seeing it at the moment, kind of as a sort of early warning, is along the east coast of the United States. It's basically because as the Gulf Stream pushes up along the eastern seaboard, it pushes water into the land. So it means that that part of the Atlantic is higher than most of the rest of the Atlantic. So you're now seeing a lot of towns along the eastern seaboard of the USA getting what they call sunny day flooding. Where what's happened is that the old sewage outlets and drain water outlets are now below sea level at high tide. So when the tide comes in, the high street gets full of water because the drains pump backwards. If you look at, if you Google sort of sea level rise in Miami Beach, you'll see all sorts of videos about how they're having to take fairly drastic action to deal with it. It kind of reminds me of when you were a kid, when you used to build sandcastles, and when the tide came in, you tried to sort of channel the water around your sandcastle. But it was always a losing battle, and sooner or later it all got washed away. So they're building, their aim is to actually build all of the seawall around Miami Beach so that it's raised a meter. I think the problem with that is you kind of think, well, okay, sea level rise isn't going to stop at that point. Just because we're using 2100 as a cutoff point doesn't mean that's where it stops. It's going to keep going. So essentially we've put enough carbon dioxide into the atmosphere now that we are looking at meters and meters of sea level rise over time. The only question is how quickly it happens. So if you like, even if we all stop burning fossil fuels altogether tomorrow morning for the whole world, that sea level rise is already there. That's going to happen. So where I think, and it's something that this country needs to look at is, well, we're going to have some communities that the value of the damage that will be done otherwise makes it worthwhile defending them. But I'm afraid there are going to be a lot of places that are on floodplains or on coastal areas that are basically not going to be worth enough for the investment. There's a place in Wales called Fairborn, which is one of these very sleepy coastal villages in Gwynedd, where the residents there have been up in arms because the Welsh government has said, we're not going to defend you. That basically the value of your properties is too small to justify the sort of sea defences that would be needed to protect them.
Millions of pounds worth, I suspect.
Yeah. I mean, any sort of flood defence scheme, you're running into several million, getting into tens of millions even. And unfortunately, we're at a time where government funding is in short supply. So we could argue that, yes, government could spend more on it. The fact of the matter is they're not spending more on it.
And they're not going to.
Yeah, so it's pushing us into that situation. And the insurance companies eventually will start to not insure properties in some areas. I mean, at the moment, you've got government underwriting, so government is making sure that people can get at least basic insurance. The problem is, somewhere like this place Fairborn, along the North Wales coast, once they announce that we're not going to defend you, your property becomes worthless. Because who in their right mind would buy your house off you? Certainly, if you're moving in, you're not going to get insurance to buy the property. Mm-hmm. So even if the insurance companies say, well, under the government scheme, we'll continue to insure you, what you can't do at that point is sell up and move on. I mean, unless you're fortunate enough to have enough money in your back pocket that you can just write off that house and just start again, which, of course, a lot of these places tend to be older people that have moved out that way. So sadly, I mean, we are going to find properties that can't be sold. We're going to find areas that can't be defended. I mean, barring us actually having a serious policy discussion about how we deal with it, which at the moment I don't think we've quite got to. I mean, I think government got worried with last winter. And the winter of 2013, where we had the Somerset levels and a few, was it the Thames area, got flooded. Mm. They were told that was a 1 in 100-year event. And I think everyone thought, well, okay, it's one of those things, but look, let's not get too worried. We've got another 100 years before the next one. Because the next 100-year event has come 2 years later.
Yes. Mm.
Yeah, now, if we have this year and we end up with another 1 in 100-year flood this year, that starts to suggest that what we're talking about here isn't a 1 in 100-year flood, it's a 1 in 5-year flood.
It's here.
Once you start to do that, then you need a whole different way of approaching it. And of course, let's remember that our housing stock is overcrowded in short supply already. So if we're going to sort of take towns and villages across the UK and say, well, these properties are no longer worth anything, then we've got to look at, well, where are those people going to go? Because people are already struggling to find housing. Mm. Again, I don't have any easy answers to that. I mean, one I suspect is we don't actually have a shortage of housing. What we have is a shortage of housing in the places that people want to be. So basically, there are parts of the upper South Wales valleys where you could buy an entire housing estate for the cost of a house on the south coast. And it's just because nobody wants to live there.
And why is that?
Well, because there's no work there. So basically you have overcrowding at your end of the country because people want to work in and around London. So you have massive pressure on property. One of the results is it drives up the cost of property way out of ordinary people's reach.
I've never understood that. Why it is that, I mean, we've got entrepreneurs all around Britain. Why these areas become no work areas? There's still people there. There's got to be the same.
Well, I'm reminded of a story somebody told me about a guy in, I think it was Nigeria. And what he was doing was selling fruit on the side of the road. And somebody had said of him, this guy was really bright. He kind of university graduate, he knew his stuff. And they said, well, why is this guy selling fruit on the side of the road, for God's sake? And his answer was, because that's all the people around here can afford to buy. That's the problem, is if you go to the upper South Wales valleys and you want to start a business, it's going to have to be selling something cheap. Because actually people haven't got huge amounts of money to buy. You move on into London, you've got all of that financial district going on there where people are loaded with money and it spills over. Similarly, until recently, if you went to Aberdeen, you had all of that oil industry money spilling over, so that was a desirable place to be. And now it's starting to look like a bit of a ghost town because everyone's being laid off. So essentially the problem is we have areas of the country that have lots of empty houses because there's no demand to be there. Whereas we have other parts of the country that have huge demand for houses because there's a massive demand for the jobs that way. And basically, until and unless you rebalance that, I don't see that you ever get an end to the housing crisis.
It's crazy, doesn't it?
Well, part of the reason we're on the floodplains with housing is because the floodplains are all we've got left. Unless you want to totally rip up the green belt and just have all of the towns and cities merge into one. It's not easy to kind of work that one through.
It's not, but then if you fly over Britain, she says.
Yeah, lots of space.
But I have, regardless of the eco-friendliness of that, I have done it, and it's Britain's covered in fields. We're totally green. We've got a few great big urban areas, and lots and lots of green.
Well, I mean, if we were living in China, one of the things the Chinese would do is just say, well, we don't care what you think. You're going to go and build your factory in the place where the houses are.
Yes.
If need be, they'll just build an entire new city because they've got lots of empty ones. But the point is they would actually direct what's happening, whereas we do a free market thing. And the result of a free market is everyone wants to go to London.
Because it's got the biggest population.
Well, and more concretely, if you're a student coming out of university, you've got 50 odd grand's worth of debt to pay off. You're not going to get that debt paid off if you get a job flipping burgers in sort of Bryn Mawr McDonald's. Whereas if you can get an internship and get yourself on the ladder into the city, within a couple of years, that debt's going to be paid off and you can start saving for your house. So if you're a youngster and you've got the ability to do that, that is, I mean, if that was me at this stage, I guess that's what I'd be doing. I mean, the problem is that not everyone can, and kind of other areas of the country start becoming impoverished as a result. As I say, if government stepped in and said, well, no, we're going to locate industry in parts of the country that are run down, then we might build up the base, but nobody's really going to do that. Trying to think the last time they did it was Harold Wilson's government in the 70s moved government departments out to the regions. So I think in Wales we have the Patent Office in Newport and the DVLA down in Swansea. And they were decisions that, if the government is going to employ a couple of thousand people doing driving licenses, well, let's put them somewhere where they need jobs.
Yes.
So, okay, the government can kind of do that still. But our culture doesn't allow that you'd say to a businessman, well, sorry, you can't start your business in London. You're going to have to go to Sunderland. That's not the way we do it. I wonder in the end whether one way or another we might be forced to.
That's one of the things I've been thinking about, because we're looking to move from where we are, and quite obvious that if we stay in the London area, with the money we have, you can get a small, tiny little flat. You go a bit further out, you get a nice bungalow with a garden. You go a bit further out still, you can have a bungalow with a nice big farm attached, or a small farm attached, small holding attached. And the small holding is pretty inviting at this point in my life. But then, given another 10, 15 years, I might not be able to handle it. But, can you set it up? That's one of the things I've been thinking. Can I set it up as a social enterprise right now and create a business? Because I know how to run a business, but then I know how to run a business in the southeast, whether it works the same way in the north or in Wales or wherever, is yet to be determined. Could be quite. I find myself finding it much harder.
I suppose the dynamics are the same. The costs are going to be different. As I say, you can buy property in parts of Wales really cheaply, but the reason for that is there's no work in the area. Now, if you're in,
that's what I'm wondering. Can you create work?
That's the point. So, I mean, most people, when they're looking for a job, don't want to run a business. Most people actually want somebody else to do all of the planning and the management. They just want to turn up at 9 in the morning and go home at 5.
And get the money.
Get a salary or a wage at the end of the week. So essentially, if that's what you want, then you tend to have to gravitate to the cities, and particularly the southeast, in order to get that kind of work for a decent salary. if you're prepared to put the time into sort of setting up something of your own that has multiple customers and do all of the hard work of balancing all of that out and making sure your cash flow is there, then yes, you can do it, and people do. I have a friend of mine that runs a shop down in Narberth who I think probably breaks even, but not much more. So part of what you do is actually settle for a lower standard of living than you might do in the southeast. But then I tend to think that a lot of why we end up with sort of high costs of living in places like the southeast is that it's so stressful to live there that you end up having to spend an awful lot on food and booze and cigarettes and all the rest of it to numb the pain. Whereas down in West Wales or up in the upper valleys, rather than going in drunk, you can do a lot better just by going for a walk out in the countryside, which is actually quite spectacular.
I really wonder about that because, as you say, if the local area hasn't got the funding to spend on things, you've got more of a problem. But I suppose you have to have an internet business where you can send those goods to wherever the people are. It doesn't really matter where they live. If you're producing something that people want, and if you can produce it in an area which is relatively cheap, then presumably you're going to be a bit more competitive.
Yeah, I mean, depending on what business you do, my book sales are global. One of the reasons I'm not quite as worried about the pound dropping in value is I get a lot of royalties in dollars. It's essentially what I'm losing on the pounds, I'm getting back on the dollars, which, so okay, you could do that sort of thing. I mean, there's plenty of online business type stuff that you can do where it doesn't really matter where you're located, other than that you're going to need a decent broadband connection, which is worth checking.
Yeah.
Another advantage in Wales with things like social enterprises, there is sort of some money sloshing around to sort of give you a helping hand. Usually it's to do with job creation, so you've got to kind of come up with business plans that are realistic. So again, there are parts of the country where you might get grants and stuff towards setting something up. But in the end, and I just think with the housing situation, ultimately, basically, I don't see us ever having the sort of round of house building that we've seen certainly in the 50s after the war, where, you have a look at most cities have huge housing estates from the 50s. I think the next wave would have been the late 70s, early 80s. So you have a wave of properties in the early 80s. That was probably the last time that Britain saw mass scale building. So we've had these big waves of building. I don't see that happening again. So essentially the kind of building we've got now, which is woefully inadequate to the demand, basically what that tells me is sooner or later, who knows what that actually amounts to, but you've got a lot of councils and housing associations and stuff who have a duty to house people. I think sooner or later these people are going to be going to these abandoned estates, refurbishing them and moving people there. Because I don't think there's going to be any other choice. And you can't keep housing people in bed and breakfast, which is actually more expensive than housing them in houses.
Of course.
So I think in a sense something's got to give. I suspect that's where it'll come from. The question then is going to be, well, how do we encourage people to set up businesses in those areas? How do we get the local economy going?
Yes, the thing is that these people are something, not all of them are able to, but many of them are competent and capable of working, but they're maybe not necessarily business growers.
Yeah, but then I wonder to a degree whether we're all going to be pushed in the direction of growing businesses at some point. There's an interesting report in the papers today from McKinsey, which is the kind of big business sort of think tank in the States. But they've looked at what's called the gig economy, which is all of your Airbnb, sort of, what do they call it, the delivery one, Deliveroo and Uber. And what they found is it's far more prevalent than anyone had thought. So until now, the thinking was, the survey they'd done was across America, the UK and Europe. The thinking was, okay, there's going to be a handful of people that are running, driving taxis for Uber. What they found is over 30% of us are actually either working in the gig economy or are doing work in the gig economy. As the other thing they found was 30% of those are doing it unwillingly. So essentially there are a lot of people who just can't find anything else to do, so actually setting up and doing your own business online becomes the only way of making a living. But their point was none of the employment or unemployment statistics that we're currently running across the world are actually recording that type of employment.
No, that's quite obvious that governments don't want to, because then it would show up that it's not as good as they think or they like it to be. Demonstrating. But and the thing is that once you're self-employed, even if you earn nothing, you're still self-employed. You're still employed. You're no longer on the unemployed list. And if you decide because your business is just not making any money at all and you cannot sustain it and you back out and say, sorry, close shop, then you've made yourself unemployed, and therefore you still aren't entitled to any benefits or any help or anything for the next, whatever it is, 6 months or so. So it means that, they don't have to count you.
Yeah, clearly that's why they're not recording it. But then I guess what the McKinsey people were saying is, well, hey, hang on a minute, this is now such a significant part of what people are doing that you really do. Even if you don't do anything about it, even if you don't change the figures, you need to know this because the policies that you're implementing have a direct impact on this. So essentially we're all still pretending that everybody just goes to work in a job somewhere. And it turns out that a third of us don't. A third of us are working in this kind of it's like a patchwork of things that you're doing. A bit of web design here, a bit of graphic design over there, kind of, whatever your bag is. Selling stuff through sites like Fiverr or... for 20 quid, I'll do your business card for you, all of those kind of things, where you're relying on building a customer base. The odds are if you're in there in the unwilling side of it, you're not getting paid a great deal. So essentially all you've done is replace the minimum wage job that you would have been on if you'd been fortunate enough to find a job. So essentially, if you have then all of the policies like welfare that go around that, so as you say, if you go sick and you're working in the gig economy, you haven't got any protection. There's no sick pay.
No.
But then government needs to start thinking about, actually, if a third of the population are in that position, maybe we need to tweak things like sick pay. Because actually what happens, the point here isn't kind of, we've got to look after these people. The point to me is the knock-on cost if you don't. Because essentially if that person gets sick, then not only does their livelihood go, but their housing probably goes. That's going to go through a process of repossession or whatever, but suddenly you've now got a homeless person to look after. Not only that, but they were sick when they went homeless, so the odds are you've got a social care problem as well. And if you don't deal with it, it'll become a health problem.
But unfortunately they do, don't they? It's just left and left and left. That's been shown many times, particularly in the mental health sphere.
Yeah, sure. Mental health is the favourite pick-on time. It always has been. We get all of these platitudes about, it's terrible, we must do something about it. Nobody ever does.
Because they're not able to fight for themselves because they're already ill.
That's part of the problem. If you're depressed and somebody tells you you're not worthy of having any help, you probably believe it. It's very difficult to fight back when you're that unwell. So sure, yes, if you had, my favourite counter to it was always breast cancer. And I'm not in any way saying that we shouldn't treat breast cancer. It's just the difference between the way the two are treated. But breast cancer, you had a lot of very high-profile women that got involved in campaigning around it. In fact, during the Labour years, when Labour were in government, Sherry Blair was the patron of the breast cancer charity. So essentially, you don't get closer to the centre of power than being in the Prime Minister's bed. So essentially, they were able to champion that cause, and it became really big. You contrast that to what happened with mental illness, where it's, no, we're not interested. Yes, okay, we'll provide you with some counselling or whatever, but then that never actually materialised. We used to find that by the time people got to see their counsellor or their CBT therapist, they by then had become so ill, Or at least either they'd got better on their own and they didn't need them, or they'd become so ill that it wasn't going to work anyway. So yes, I mean, I think going forward, we'll probably find that the way we do things will start to shift anyway. Because I think the gig economy is here to stay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the ability of companies to put together the capital to build new enterprises of the kind we need to bring back full employment just isn't there. And part of why it isn't there, certainly in this country, is because our revenue from North Sea oil and gas has plummeted. I think they've projected that they'll be making an annual loss of about £1.2 billion every year from now to 2020. So essentially what used to be where the British government got its taxes from. So essentially, I mean, think of all of the booms through the 1980s and 1990s. You know, forget all of the political and economic nonsense that they told you was why we had that boom. The thing that gave us that boom was North Sea oil. And it's gone. You know, we're now producing a third of the oil that we had done then. It's costing more to get out of the ground, and companies are pulling out. So basically, I mean, if you looked at it at that macro level, you can say, right, we've lost 2/3 of the tax income that we used to get from there. And next to the City of London, that was our second biggest place to get taxed. So somehow we've got to replace that 2/3 of that tax take. And it isn't obvious that we have anything else that is so in short supply around the world that we can provide it. From what I can see in the local high streets, we have a lot of tattoo parlors, we have a lot of pet grooming places, we have a lot of nail bars. I don't think there's a global shortage in any of those. It's essentially...
No, and they are, in a sense, they're still luxury goods. So that actually, if you really, really push comes to shove, you don't bother to have your nails done.
So I think the smart entrepreneurs will be looking at, okay, if we have a more localized, sort of smaller economy, what are the kind of businesses that will be needed there?
Food, energy.
Food, energy. I mean, even down to very basic things like making woolen clothing again.
Their clothing and booze.
Yeah, but there are opportunities there. It's just that I think we're still stuck in this, one of these days somebody will figure it out and we'll go back to how it used to be. It's now 8 years, coming on for 9 years since the financial crisis. Actually, we're about to go into the next recession. Things aren't going back to how they were then. So I think, yes, we'll probably relocalize. At that point, I think what people are avoiding with some of the housing that we've got that's empty, the reasons for avoiding that will start to go away. Personally, I worry about where I am. So I'm on the outskirts of a city. Now, Cardiff is, by London standards, Cardiff is tiny. We have a population of about 300,000 people. I actually worry that we are sustainable. Basically, I think we could be, but it would take a lot of work. I would actually hate to be anywhere near London. Because I think, if the financial centre goes in London, which I think post-Brexit it may well do, actually London is going to be a pretty horrible place to live, because you're going to have a lot of people but not a lot of work. Because you have to look through, well, okay, you've got the finance industry, but look at all of the spill-out jobs. Sort of all of the bars, the restaurants, the shops, kind of all of the people that work there spending money into that economy. All of that will go away if the city crashes. So then you've got an area of the country that is incredibly expensive to live in, but you've lost the jobs that make it worth doing. So again, we could well see a rebalancing. If you do your history, back in the 18th century, we went through a similar process. So there was a period in the early 18th century where London was a sort of finance district. It was where everybody that was anybody lived. then from the start of the 19th century, you got the shift to the industrial cities in the north. And suddenly people moved away from all of the finance capital, all of that, and moved into production and building things and building railways and steamships. And so we've had that rebalancing before. It's not something new. I'm not plucking it off the top of my head.
No. It's just wondering what's going to be the next rebalancing. We don't really need steamships. We probably do need a few more.
Well, sailing ships would be the worst outcome. And I was amused that somebody claimed to have invented the first ship to run on renewables. If you Google it, they put this out as a press release, as a news. So we've got this ship that runs, and yeah, it runs on wind and solar power. I think they got several thousand people commenting on it, saying, I think you'll find that basically back in the days before steam, people used to go around the world in sailing ships. That yes, actually we did renewable energy before we did fossil fuels. And if worst came to worst, we could well end up back with that. And I don't see that. It may happen one day, because one day will come where we have no fossil fuels, but I don't see it immediately. My own view is that we're likely to get this intermittency, where things just stop working quite as well as we're used to. And I don't know if you spotted that I think it was the 7th biggest shipping company in the world went bust. Where you might pick it up in this country is there were a group of sea cadets on one of the ships. And the last time I heard on the news, these people are stuck offshore outside of Singapore. And basically the port won't let the ship dock because the port is worried that it isn't going to get paid. Mm-hmm. So these youngsters were stuck on there. Hopefully they've managed to get them off since. That is an example of how things break down. Mm-hmm. So essentially, we're not directly impacted. There's still stuff in the shops and everything's still going on as roughly normal. But there are all these cargo ships sort of anchored out at sea and nobody's getting paid. So basically the factories that made the goods that were on those ships haven't been paid. The shipping company itself has gone bust, so none of the docks will go anywhere near it in case they don't get paid. Now, eventually that will be sorted out because somebody will buy up they'll bankrupt it, write off the losses, and somebody will buy it out. But it becomes an example of how things break down. Gradually, as the cost of everything starts to go up and as our demand for things starts to come down, so companies become vulnerable. What they're the victim of is basically that the consumption in the West has slowed down. We're not consuming as much, therefore China isn't making as much. And suddenly we've got one shipping company too many. As I understand it, in calorie terms, we're in a similar position with supermarkets in the UK.
They've been lying to them. Tesco's has definitely sort of been trying to make out that they're selling more than they are.
Yeah, we have probably, certainly one, maybe two supermarkets too many. At the moment, we're reaping it in because they're having a trade war with each other to try to fight through to see who's going to go bust first. And that kind of means that we're getting food a lot cheaper than it's going to be. Mm-hmm. So basically, I've got money on Asda's going down. Mm-hmm. So I just think Asda seem to be in the worst position of all of the big chains. Tesco's, it sounds like, could well be the second one to go. Now, I think the problem is if Tesco's and Asda's go, then the competition between what remains is going to suddenly slacken off. And I think we'll then see the price increase.
I think we're going to see prices increasing anyway because it's coming from abroad, and now the Brexit's going to hit. It's just starting to think of us as a less important player.
Yeah, just from losing the value of the pound, anything that was coming in from abroad is going to be costing more. I suppose the positive side of that is that it should, buy local.
That's a good thing.
It should throw back suddenly the farmer up the road that's been struggling to sell his produce is suddenly more viable. So, Yeah, in a sense, I mean, I think that currency fluctuation stuff is always difficult to read because there are winners and losers on both sides. So yeah, I mean, the positive benefit could well be that British farming actually starts to have a bit of a renaissance. I mean, that shouldn't be a problem for you or I. I mean, it will be a problem if you have grown up sort of thinking that having chili and strawberries in December is some kind of human right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've been seeing all over Pinterest, black strawberries, yellow strawberries, blue, and you know, odd or white strawberries with red pips and things. And you think, well, why would you care what colour they are?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, that was, you know, I mean, that was the world before 2008. If we go local, we're going back, and it's within my lifetime. I mean, I remember going shopping with my mother as a child, where when you went to the greengrocers, the first thing you asked is, what have you got in today? You know, you didn't go to the shops thinking, oh, well, I'll get some broccoli and I'll get some strawberries. You went there and you say, what was in season that week? Mm. And it's, oh, yes, we've got some cabbages or some onions. And you worked out from what was there, okay, what can I cook?
What are you going to cook? Not the other way around. I'll go with my recipe and buy the things I need.
Yeah. So, okay, we might be going back to something more akin to that. And I doubt whether
it'll be... I've always cooked like that. So I find it quite odd when I talk to other people and they say, well, in order to make sure they don't waste anything, they decide in advance what they're going to cook. And then they write down the ingredients for these specific recipes, and they go and buy just those things. Where I've never, ever thought like that, ever. It's what's coming out the garden this week, what's going to go best with it, and, okay, what looks nice in the shop, in the butchers. I've never cooked the other way around, and I find it quite odd to think like that. You know, I might, if I've got loads and loads of courgettes, for instance, look up on the internet and see, you know, what recipes people have created using just courgettes and buy a few odd ingredients to go with, to find a different, you know, because that's the thing about seasons is it's all one and then it's all another. But you know, the idea of deciding before I go shopping what I'm going to eat, it's never occurred to me.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of struck me that there are probably three groups of us here. So there's one group, which will be younger people who were never taught how to cook. I remember they dropped sort of what they called home economics from the school curriculum years ago. You know, so that you now have a generation whose parents didn't learn to cook, so they couldn't pass it on. You have a generation that I think are like me, who can cook but don't particularly want to do anything. Then we have people like yourself that have got enough knowledge that whatever's there, you'll put something together out of it. I think that first group that never learned how to cook are the ones that are potentially in the most trouble. Because if what you're used to is sort of living out of pre-prepared meals and pre-packaged food, that is the food that's going to go up in price the most.
And also the problem with that, of course, is you do that because of, it's not always about don't want to, it is partly don't want to, but it's also about time restriction. You know, if you're working in, I mean, it's being demanded more and more and more of us that we will stay longer and longer and longer at work.
Yeah.
If you want to get on, if you want to get on and have a career, then you're expected to be in the office at 7 o'clock in the morning, and you don't leave before 7.
Yeah, and then if you're commuting an hour either side or 2 hours either side as well, then yeah, by the time you get home, I mean, if you're going to prepare anything at home, at best it's going to be a ready meal in the microwave. Yeah, I suspect for a lot of people it's a takeaway on the way home. The problem is that that's what's going to get expensive. The seasonal vegetables that you pick up are going to stay reasonably where they are.
So they've never been a subject to the price demands anyway. I think largely the supermarkets have the standard basket, you know, milk, bread, and potatoes, rice, local vegetables have always been very cheap. And the main reason that they've been kept cheap is simply because they can say, well, look, the average shopping basket is only this much. What are you talking about?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have a feeling, although I have no evidence for this, that the supermarkets mirror the national statistics people when they devise how they're going to measure inflation.
Of course they do.
So essentially, if they decide that, well, we're going to measure pork this week instead of beef, then the supermarkets will drop the price of pork accordingly. So yes, to that extent, it's fiddled.
Oh yeah, very much so, I'm afraid. I mean, I've sort of seen evidence of it, but because certainly when I was in my 20s and worked in agriculture, I can remember thinking, what? We get X amount per tonne from my wheat grain, and then, even without too much brain power, you recognise that, that Weetabix are somewhat different in, in value per tonne. You think, okay, they've got to put some manufacturing in there in the first place, and don't get me wrong, I know that costs, and I am in business, I recognise there's costs involved, but you think, whoa. And I can remember going into, because I don't think terribly many of us really take that much notice of exactly how much an individual item costs. And you go into Tesco's and you buy or wherever, whatever supermarket, or even your corner shop, and you go in and you get similar things each week, and you know that your bag of shopping comes out at, roughly so much. You know roughly what you spend. But I can remember being, when we were our very tightest, and I was in my youth, and I had 2 kids and not very much money, and because my job had stopped, and we were living on 1 farm wage, which wasn't a lot. And noticing things like, the price of the Ribena that I bought at 1 week had gone up by 30 pence the next week. And when they were only sort of 70p at that time, not nearly £2 or £3 as they are now, it's like that makes it an enormous jump. How comes people don't notice? How comes that nobody's noticed that it's gone up so much?
Yeah, but then, I guess across the economy, there are still enough people with spare cash in their pockets that they're not noticing. Although that said, of interest, the amount of food waste that Britain produces now is about a third what it was back in 2010. So essentially, we have really scaled back on the amount of food that gets dumped. I think that is a measure of the real inflation in food. That there are sufficiently enough of us paying attention to what we're wasting that it's had that kind of impact on food as a whole. So in a way, that's what I say, one of the things I observed the other night in the local supermarket was people queuing up for the reduced stuff at the end of the day. You never used to see that. People would always pick up the reduced stuff if it happened to be there. But to actually see people who are going to the shop specifically at that time of day, because they know that that's when stuff gets reduced, that isn't something that used to be that visible until recently. As I say, I think the problem then becomes, well, as the drop in the value of the pound filters through into increased import costs, that actually things that we've been taken for granted as reasonably cheap foods are likely to start going up so that group of people won't buy them anymore. And again, it becomes that death spiral that I've talked about, where you squeeze out the bottom of the economy all the time. So if you're the supermarket, one of the ways you do this is that you loss lead basic staples. The supermarket can actually sell you and I a pint of milk for less than it costs to produce. But the reason the supermarket can do that is because your Weetabix are 30p more than what they should be. Now, we as consumers don't know, because you've no way of calculating, well, what should the cost of this actually be? But that's how it's done. So, they work on, well, a sufficient number of people will buy the stuff that we've upped the price on to cover the loss we're making on these basic staples. The problem is that as the cost of food as a whole starts to go up and people at the bottom stop buying it, then you're relying on an ever-shrinking group of people to pay that extra on the premium range. And eventually there aren't going to be enough people with enough spare cash to do that. So then the supermarkets go bust. I think that's probably the trend that the supermarkets will go through. I don't particularly see a way out. Because I don't see And I don't see a government tax take to replace North Sea oil to the extent that it will ever bring back that kind of level of government borrowing, government's ability, if you like, to prop up the currency. Our balance of payments at the moment is at record levels. I mean, we owe the rest of the world a shed load of money, and nobody is altogether sure where we're going to pay it back from. But one of the ways we pay it back is by devaluing the pound. I mean, if the value of the pound got down to almost nothing, you could say, right, how many pounds do I owe you? I have lots of them. That's one of the ways you pay your debts. The problem is for you and I living in that economy with the pound dropping in value, it suddenly means that the only stuff we can afford to buy is stuff made locally. And that has a benefit in the long term. It's really good in terms of sustainability. Where it's problematic is in how we shift from where we are to where we're going to be. I've always maintained that if we get to that kind of economic crisis where we do relocalize, we will find that easier to do than to live through the transition. Because basically things that we've taken for granted for so long now, if they stop working, it's going to be very difficult to replace them. British agriculture isn't geared up to supplying you and I with food. Our agriculture at the moment is, the dairy industry ships a huge amount of its product in dry form to China. So we can't automatically assume that, we'll shift that to feeding us, because actually they're geared up in the wrong way. I wonder whether a lot of those big dairy plants then would have to go back to some kind of mixed agriculture. I'd
be fairly sure that they would, because I can remember when I left college in my 20s that the average dairy farm was sort of 80, 100, 120 cows. And they're all gone. They virtually don't exist anymore. They're 500 or more. And they're run by 2 or 3 people, so you'll have 3 times a day milking quite often. Or there are a few smaller farms left, but not very many, and they certainly don't rely totally on cows. If they are dairy farmers primarily, they're still going to be having at least some other income coming, and it may be that they bought up a couple of flats in the village and they have a bit of rent money coming, or they do wheat, or they rent out some buildings to do something. Somebody's renting the buildings for whatever, workshops of all sorts of things. Very, very few and are doing just specialist stuff anymore, although I suspect that might increase, because if you are, as a business, if you keep all your funding in one arena, you are at least really using that stuff to this height, so that if you put a large quantity of money into making ice cream, for instance, that's what you're going to be good at doing, and to do some other enterprise means another big investment. You've got to invest in some other bits of equipment or whatever, which may or may not be as profitable. I would say most companies are better off focusing on 1 or 2 things and get that really right, and until they're really successful before they start to take on something else. And that's from my perspective, and I don't run a huge business, so maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but that's how I see things working best. At the same time, if you've got all your eggs in one basket, every single one, then you do really, really, really have to be very, very good at it, and to make sure that that you at least have a large enough client base that somebody else isn't going to come and knock you off your perch.
Yeah, that's the downside. When I was running the charity, and the big thing in the charity sector was multiple income streams. So it's essentially, do not leave yourself reliant on one income stream, because if that goes, you're finished. I suspect that's easier to do as a charity than it is to do as a business, because with a charity, you're attracting donors, not customers. With a business, as you say, you've then got the problem of, I can't just move into something that I'm no good at. Although actually I saw a lot of charities that started doing stuff that they were no good at just because there was money in it. I mean, that tends to be something that's a problem with the bigger charities rather than the smaller ones, but it's that constant, where is the money? Oh, I'll go and do that. Yeah, it's going to be a balance, I guess, that I mean, partly it's, yes, I'll keep doing what I'm good at and try to make that a basic income, and then see if there are other things that I can have as an additional cash flow.
Anyway, we're about 4:15 now, so we're well over our time. Is there any snippets you'd like to share with people on how to better their future life?
At this stage, actually develop your own skills separately from what you're being paid to do. I mean, certainly that one that we just talked about, if you don't know how to cook, go and find a course. There are lots of them. Learn to cook. I mean, it can be quite a lot of fun. It can save you a lot of money, and in the event of the supermarket suddenly closing because of some economic crisis, it will stand you in good stead.
Yes, I would say definitely the home skills are going to be the ones that are going to be the most critical. If there's a downturn in finance or economy of any kind, it's how can you keep more pennies in? Because I kind of think of little homelets as little businesses in a way. We have a home, a family to feed, a group of people working together, some of whom might be earning, some of whom are learning and growing up, some of whom may be on the older end of the scale and need more care. But at the end of the day, that's a little unit. It's a little business in a way. How much money can you get in the door, and how much can you keep, and how much needs to be generated? And also, how best to utilize it. It is like running a small business, and I would say that, yes, skill up is a good add-in.
Yeah.
Good evening.